Welcome everyone to Video Chess Training. I'm International Master William Paschall. Today we're going to start a series here of videos entitled Advanced Chess Strategy. In this series we're going to feature games between strong grandmasters where I'll commentate and explain the principles involved. The following game is a favorite of mine. I analyzed this game a long time ago, probably 15 years ago for the first time, and I think even now, much later, I feel this is one of the most interesting struggles I've seen on the chessboard. Both players are very strong. World-class player playing white, it's Grandmaster Michael Adams, who was at the time rated well over 2,700 according to the FIDE rating system, and black is the Moldovan Grandmaster Viorel Bologan, and Bologan was way over 2,600. Both very strong players, and this game took place in Germany in, I believe, 1998. So Adams is playing white. Adams is a very strong, strategic grandmaster, and his style is characteristically like positional, also very alert and strong tactically, but his game isn't based around tactics, and Bologan is a world-class player as well. Bologan takes a chance here. He plays g6 on move 1, and this kind of hyper-modern opening, honestly, is playable. You see it a lot in modern chess, but I think that it's risky. It's very, very risky. I think it's a good way to play against weaker players if you're black, to try to create a complicated game. But when you're playing against a world-class player who outrates you, I think to play such a hyper-modern system is kind of taking your life in your hands. So Bologan, it's his repertoire. He plays g6, okay? Adams plays d4. And black plays bishop g7, knight to c3. This is the most aggressive move for white. He keeps the c-pawn back, reserving the possibility of castling queenside. In some positions, white plays f4 in these lines. And now Bologan could play a lot of moves. d6, even c5, c6 is played in the game. And the position is similar to the Caro-Kann. It's actually half modern defense, half Caro-Kann. White now, the main move is probably f4, but it can lead to very closed structures after f4, d5, e5. So Adams' move here, knight f3, it's not a matter that it's like more passive than f4 per se. He doesn't want to necessarily close the center. So white, like in the French defense, it's hard to keep the tension. Similar sort of principle here, or in the Caro-Kann. Hard for white to kind of keep the tension in the center, but you attempt to do that by playing knight f3. And after d5, exchanging on d5, not really achieving a lot. So taking back with the c-pawn, e takes d, c takes d, this serves to help black to have better control of the center. White is reluctant to play e5. That's a line here. I mean, e5 is a move, but probably we'd prefer to have played f4 if we're going to play e5. So h3. This is a great move which just keeps the tension in the center. It's hard for black, who has less space, to make a good waiting move. So in this position, theoretically, there are at least 3 moves for black. The game in question, black played knight f6, which makes sense, inducing the move e5. This is an old move that I think goes back into the 50s, probably. It's been played for about 60 years. And black could also exchange on e4, turning it into a kind of Caro-Kann, which is reasonable. And finally, black can play, I think, an interesting move, knight h6, which leaves the diagonal for the g7 bishop open and gives him options to play, keeping the tension with something like f6 and knight f7 sometimes. And this kind of so-called rat plan with f6, knight h6, knight f7, not unusual in the modern defense. So knight h6 is maybe the most tense move. Knight f6, I guess, is considered more mainline. Now white really doesn't have a choice. You can't take on d5 here and expect to have an advantage, so e5. Bishop d3 I guess you could play, but it trades a set of pieces. I think it doesn't really make sense. e5, knight e4, and now white has 2 moves. I've played both of these moves myself. Bishop d3 is interesting, kind of forcing black to take on c3. when the position resembles a sort of French defense, I think white can try to get a slight advantage there. Despite the doubled pawns, he has a very good control of the center. Black has problems with the c8 bishop. The c8 bishop is actually kind of the focal point, if you will, of the entire game in question. This piece, this bishop, the queen's bishop on c8, it never really knows where it wants to go, oftentimes, after the move h3. This happens in many openings, especially fianchetto openings like the Grunfeld variation or Grunfeld defense. Oftentimes the bishop just waits and sometimes goes to all of the possible squares, sometimes g4, f5, e6, d7. It depends, maybe fianchetto. It's not clear where that piece's journey lies ahead. So anyway, Adams takes on e4. This is a known variation that highlights the weakness of the pawn on e4. So knight takes e4, pawn takes e4, and the white knight is just chased away from the center with knight to g5. And f5 wouldn't solve black's problems. It wouldn't ultimately defend the pawn on e4 because white has the capture. E takes f6 en passant. So in passing, black must find another way to defend the pawn or create active counterplay. And then c5. And I guess in this position white has played a lot of different moves. But Adams's reply is the positional approach, and I think this is totally as good as any other move white can try here. Giving the pawn back, and he's going to win a pawn and get a pawn back, but kind of close the center, fix the center in a stable situation. d5. White has a very good space advantage thanks to the pawn on d5. Black takes the pawn on e5. White takes the pawn on e4. And things have clarified a bit. White has a spatial advantage because of the pawn on d5. Though black has managed to trade one set of pieces, which should make his spatial disadvantage a little bit less significant than it otherwise might be. Here after this capture, now knight d7, this defends the c5 pawn. It's not necessary. You can castle first because of the threat of queen a5 check. I think it's typical to see castles and then c3, knight d7. White has the independent try here, bishop h6. And I would think that would be interesting. c3, and we transpose with castles. Now, white to play, bishop h6. Black doesn't really want to trade the dark squared bishop. He would like to trade more pieces due to his spatial disadvantage, but trading the dark squared bishop will possibly create weaknesses around the black king because he doesn't have the bishop to defend the fianchetto position. This is where the game is going to revolve quite a bit around the black castled king. And white has a spatial advantage on d5, making it a little hard for black to get actively developed. Rook to e8, and now bishop b5. This move is certainly not the first move that a lot of us would consider. Why is that the case? If this was a beginner's video, I would say, okay, kudos, you see the tactical possibilities with the bishop on b5 against the rook on e8. But a more advanced player is going to look at this and say, okay, bishop b5, ultimately, where's it going to go? It may have to trade itself for the knight on d7. And bishops are worth more than knights, right? I mean, we don't generally want to trade bishop for knight without some kind of justification. In this position, there's a lot going on. It's kind of subtle, and I think that much deeper than you might even imagine. Adams here playing kind of a deep conceptual plan. Bishop e5, I don't think was ever played before this game. I think this is Adams's innovation. A more like bishop e2 move would be completely normal here. So bishop e5, and there are interesting pawn sacrifices going on here. I mean, one of the things that it does is actually weakens the pawn on c5. So we might be able to take the pawn on c5. But oddly enough, I don't think that's white's idea. Later, there was a game played where black played queen c7, which is a sound move and defends the pawn on c5. It's not really clear it's necessary to defend the pawn on c5. I'll show you why. After a6, Adams does take on d7. This is consequent. Why would we play bishop b5 if we're not going to take on d7? We're not going to just retreat our bishop and give black b5, bishop b7, and quick development of the fianchetto bishop on c8 to b7. So we take, And here, black can't really take with the queen because of knight takes c5, and after maybe queen b5, white could choose between several different moves, but I guess knight b3, and he's a pawn up. So here bishop takes d7, and it's an interesting pawn sacrifice. I don't know if Bologan analyzed this in advance or just worked it out over the board, but the jury's out on this knight takes c5 thing. Adams didn't want any part in it, and when I looked at it in more detail, after knight takes c5, it's looking like knight takes c5 and bishop b5. Looks like black has compensation for the sacrificed pawn. So instead he castles kingside. And this is, I think, the best part of the game. I mean, Adams here, a solid player, 2,700 plus. At this point in his career, I think in the top 15 in the world, maybe higher. And he, just gives up the bishop pair. What is his justification for giving up the bishop pair if it's not to win this pawn on c5? Any computer program is going to try to grab the pawn on c5. The concept here is a pretty deep one, and Adams in particular is kind of expert in playing positions where there are questions arising involving the minor pieces, like which situation is it best to have a knight? Which situation is it best to have a bishop? Where would the two bishops be good? When do I want a pair of knights? How do these combinations of pieces interact with each other? And Mickey Adams is a very, very talented positional player who I think sort of excels in making decisions revolving around whether to keep knights versus bishops in which kind of situations. So what's his idea? Well, there's a couple of things here. The first one is the space advantage due to d5. It looks like if you cut the board in half, white has what one grandmaster I know referred to as a student body attack. Okay, you have more pieces that can concentrate in one area than the other player has. So the pieces for white, the queen can come out to the king side like f3, which it does, and h6 bishop, knight on e4, difficult to displace, against the black pieces where he really only has the two bishops that can control squares directly around the king. So it appears that white has the ability to create threats against the black king side with his pieces. And the thing about it is the knight and the bishop can work on the same color. So the knight can control any color, and the bishop can only control the color it starts on. So here white can use his bishop and knight to attack dark squares. But black only has one minor piece that can defend the dark squares. So if I bring the queen into the fray on the king side, like f3, now I have a knight, a queen, and a bishop that can concentrate on attacking dark squares. Whereas black only has basically the king and the bishop that can protect the dark squares. Maybe the queen if it can come out to the game actively, like on b6 or something, and defend laterally. So Adams, I think, judging well the activity of his knight, and judging that his ability to attack on the dark squares with both minor pieces can be very effective here. The white squared bishop particularly, in a lot of openings, can be difficult for black, as on c8, not finding a home, not finding natural square. You'll see in the game what happens here. Queen c7, rook e1, Adams very principled, taking the open file, rook on a to d8, and I have no argument with these moves by both players. Now queen f3, you see naturally maybe the rook will come to d1, and already Adams has direct attacking ideas based on knight to g5. So at this point, here Bologan plays bishop f5. Now bishop f5, this move, does black really feel good about this bishop on f5? It can get attacked by g4. What is his point? He wants to trade it, He wants to play bishop takes e4. He's at the point where he's saying, I'm scared that you can have some threats on the king side. I'm willing to trade my bishop pair for your knight at e4. And by the way, you have to watch out for your d5 pawn. That might be hanging at some point. So Adams here, with the space advantage, doesn't want to trade pieces. His plan is knight g5. And with knight g5, He has indirect threats against f7. He could, in some lines, attack h7 as well. So it's 3 pieces in the vicinity of the black king. He's already threatening knight takes f7 and possibly g4 with a sort of temporary piece sacrifice. It looks like a very strong threat immediately. So Bologan plays bishop f6. This move, it's a kind of scared, hesitant move. The other option was maybe better. f6 for black. After f6, black weakens his position, but I'm not sure. Knight e4, knight e6, black can trade, possibly trade the bishop for knight, and I'm not sure white has enough for a serious advantage. So in the game, he plays bishop f6, rook e2, building up. Now this is a different story. White's d5 is defended. Trading the dark squared bishop for the knight. What's going to happen there? It's kind of similar situation. We have now opposite colored bishops and queens on the board. Opposite colored bishops are famous for endgames with purely opposite colored bishops, where oftentimes it's a draw even if you're 1 or 2 pawns up, because the pawns just get locked on one color and you can't make progress. But the opposite is true in the middle game when there's queens or even just rooks on the board. One side can attack on one color complex. Here white can attack on the dark squares. So this exchange of bishop for knight is even worse than the other one. The other one wouldn't be so bad, but to give up the dark squared bishop is not really the ideal thing for Bologan. c4, this is a good move, sort of artificially isolating white's pawn on d5 and creating an outpost. It sounds kind of funny, but an outpost for the bishop on d3. Rook on a to e1, queen d7, reinforcing the bishop on f5, tightening up the position and double attacking d5. And then g4. g4 now. Dangerous looking threats. Bishop d3. Rook e3, and then black cannot take the pawn on d5. Queen takes d5, queen takes d5, rook takes d5 would be fine. But after queen takes d5, white has queen takes f6, bishop. And then if you take on f6, we take on e8 with checkmate in 2 moves. Bishop takes g5. Bishop takes g5. Now Adams has achieved very good threats on the dark squares. So Bologan has nothing better than f6. And here is a fantastic position where the strategic Michael Adams fails to find a very, very difficult move in this. This is, you can say it's tactic, but it's also kind of strategic idea. Everything is based around the weakness. So at this point, white could have played d6. And after d6, it's very difficult for black. Maybe he's lost after d6. It's an extremely difficult situation. d6 undermines the protection of the pawn on f6. And if you take on g5, we play rook takes e7. Rook takes e7, threatening mate with queen f7 and queen g7 or queen h7. And rook f8 loses to queen d5 check. So black can just resign here. You can't take on g5. What can you do? You can take with the queen on d5. This is the best, or sorry, d6. This is the most interesting variation. And after this queen takes d6, white, this is the most complicated line for Adams to have seen. He has to find bishop takes f6 when black can't take back because of the rook. And he also has to see that rook f8, pinning the bishop to the queen, ultimately leaves white better after the intermezzo rook e6. Admittedly, this was hard to see. This was really hard to see. But I mean, I'm certain that Michael Adams was capable enough, finding this on a good day. So this looks like a huge advantage for white, and this was the way to go. After the game continuation, things are not so easy, and I think Bologan was probably okay again when Adams plays here instead bishop h6. Bishop h6, king f7, and I think black is out of hot water, basically. Mickey has this idea rook e5, when you can't ever capture the rook, and defending the pawn on d5. I think there's kind of like dynamic equilibrium going on here. Bologan finally managed to sort of salvage the position. No doubt he's a little nervous about having his king on f7, but there's looking like there's no easy way for white to improve the position. I mean, he has the bishop on d3 defending like g6, and if white plays g5, black can play the bishop back to f5. I think this is the most important idea. If g5, f5. So at this point it looks like black is okay. However, he played king back to g8, immediately inconsistent. Maybe he's just expecting a draw at this point, hoping for a repetition of position. Adams plays rook e6 though, and things are not the same anymore. So there was one moment where Bologan was okay, but once he allows rook e6, with renewed tactics against f6 and e7, he's in hot water again. And there's no respite from Adams now. Queen takes d5, queen takes d5, rook takes d5, and here we win a pawn, but we have a rook on the 7th rank. Rook takes e7, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, and then rook a5. Interesting is also the move rook b5. So this was an alternative. It holds the b7 pawn and it threatens the pawn on b2. I don't know which one was better, but the a rook move would have been more aggressive, whereas the b rook move, it seems like it's sort of holding, but it's not as aggressive. White can probably defend the pawn on b2 with maybe bishop c1 potentially. On the other hand, he may decide to just give up the b2 pawn. But rook b5 was interesting. Instead, rook a5, and now rook g7 check, when king h8, rook f7, and black has to resign because of forced mate. So he bravely ventures out with king f8, and the best white has is winning the pawn on g6. Rook takes g6, check, which isolates the black pawns on the king side. The h7 and the f6 pawns are isolated now. The black king gets away. And we have to win the game again, basically. Rook g7 check, king e6, rook takes b7, and as you can see, white is 2 pawns up temporarily, but more importantly, Adams has isolated all of Bologan's pawns. Now, we talked about obstacle bishop endgames. I mean, the truth is that pure obstacle bishop endgames are drawish, but with the rooks on the board, oftentimes it's very difficult. The bishop and the rook and the king can create mating threats. Rook takes a2, rook b6 check, king f7, and then bishop e3. This is the key move, centralizing the bishop from where it can defend c3 and the white pawn chain, even keep an eye on the a pawn, the black a pawn, but centralize itself at d4 and begin a final assault against the black king side pawns on h7 and f6. So white coordinates, centralizes, rook a5 trying to defend, king h2. Adams cautiously putting his king on the dark square. King g2 would have been fine too, but I think it's just a kind of matter of practice that Adams just carefully keeps his king on the dark squares just to be on the safe side. h5. This move is losing. Better was f5. After f5, g5, I think. g5, white has a clear advantage, and he may be winning. He's probably winning, but it would have been a little bit harder because he doesn't have a passed pawn. He's going to have to work with like h4, h5, king g3, king f4. He's going to have to work to create a passed pawn. But Bologan blunders here. I think it was time pressure related. It was probably a 40 move time control for this game. So Bologan blunders with h5 at this point. Sadly, h5, the losing move for sure. He may have been lost already. Bishop d4, and it's not about winning the pawn on f6 because black can't defend it. He can push it to f5, but the passer for white with g5, now that the h pawn is on h5, makes the g5 pawn a devastating passed pawn. Black can't stop it, so he's just completely lost. It will become a queen or force black to sacrifice a piece to stop it. After g5, rook b5, g6 check, the king goes back, and rook takes a6. Not to mention the fact that the white king can just move up the board with g3, king f4, king g5, king h6, king f6. White is threatening mate with rook a8, and he is up 2 pawns here, so there's no respite for black. Rook b8, and this is time control, I believe, 40 moves. And Adams plays king g3, and Bologan resigned. Adams can simply threaten, among other things, king f4, followed by king g5, rook a7, rook h7, and forced mate with rook h8. So I hope you enjoyed this advanced chess strategy lesson. Again, the game Adams versus Bologan from the German Bundesliga 1998. A highly subtle and interesting game. Bologan played credibly, and I think he should have earned a draw, but just a few slips. Notably at the end h5, but I think it was already maybe beyond saving there. In the middle game, when he played king f7, he was probably holding on. But the passive move king g8, maybe the last mistake. Thanks for joining me here at Video Chess Training on YouTube. I'm International Master William Paschall. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel, and see you soon. Bye-bye.